it's being recorded. So thank you for attending this session today. So, whoops, too many slides. I can't navigate through the slides. So the schedule for today, we have the talk that's coming up right now, which I will introduce in more detail in a moment. Then Luigi Longobardi will be talking about how to write a successful scientific paper. And we will then end our afternoon of sessions with a panel discussion about using social media to promote your research. Right now, for our first session, I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Seema Yasmi, who will be talking to us about the importance of science communication. Dr. Yasmi is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, poet, medical doctor, and author. At Stanford, currently, she is a clinical assistant professor of medicine and director of the Health Communication Initiative. Dr. Yasmi trained in journalism at the University of Toronto and in medicine at the University of Cambridge. She served as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where she investigated disease outbreaks. Dr. Yasmi was a John S. Knight Fellow in Journalism at Stanford University, investigating the spread of health misinformation and disinformation during epidemics. She was also a science correspondent at the Dallas Morning News, medical analyst for CNN, and professor of public health at the University of Texas at Dallas. Her writing has earned awards and residencies from the Mid-Atlantic Arts Council, Hedgebrook, and the Malay Colony for the Arts, and others. So please help me welcome Dr. Yasmi.
Thank you so much. If I'd known you were going to read out the bio, I would have sent a much shorter one. But thank you. Thanks for having me today. And thank you to everyone who's involved with organizing these 2 days of events. I think it's wonderful that we have a focus on science communication as people who are often knee deep in doing the science, thinking about the science. And then suddenly at the end of it, we're given this responsibility of now you must share your message. You have some really great events coming up, including sessions about how to write a scientific paper, how to interact with the press, how to use and not use social media, which are really relevant and very important. I myself teach social media and professionalism to our medical students and to some of our physicians as well. But since I'm getting everything started, I just wanted to start with this broader theme of why is science communication important? And because I am less interested in my story and more interested in learning about what you do, what questions, concerns, what curiosities you have about science communication, whether you think it's important or not. I'm more interested in that than in talking. So I'll talk for a little bit, but then I would love for this to be an interactive session where we have lots of Q&A, because I just think that's a lot more interesting for everyone, including me. A little about myself. I am someone who never thought I would have much to do with science communication, let alone leading up a initiative that has the words health communication in it. When I was in medical school, I really wanted to be a surgeon, and we would have those sessions on communication, and I really thought it was too much communication stuff. So I've definitely had a journey myself in terms of coming to realize how crucial communication is. That story really started on the Navajo Nation, and on a bunch of places where I was doing epidemic investigations when I was an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And what would happen, this was really typical, there'd be an outbreak somewhere in the US, in the world. I'd get the call to go and figure out what the contagion was, to try and stop it, to figure out what was happening, who was the index case, all of these things. And my sole focus when I was in an outbreak zone was really what disease is spreading, who's at risk, and how do we stop it from spreading. But something that I noticed while I was in the Epidemic Intelligence Service was that every time I got sent to a different hot zone, it wasn't just a pathogen that was spreading, even though that's kind of what my sole focus was. There were also rumors spreading. People were really scared, they were anxious because this awful thing was happening in their backyard. And there were medical myths and pseudoscience and all sorts of misinformation and disinformation spreading in tandem with the pathogen. I have to say, in the context of a pandemic, I feel like people are really just understanding this a lot more. In the few years prior to the pandemic, a lot of my work, my scholarly work, has been trying to convince people that the spread of misinformation and disinformation is a public health threat. And I think that agencies and organizations like WHO are understanding that a lot more. But back then, when I was at the CDC about 9 years ago, the focus was on a pathogen, less so on information. And I started to realize that this was really myopic, but that also at the end of an investigation, when the epidemic was done and dusted and everything was wrapped up, my job was to then present my information to my peers at conferences, to write up what had happened during the epidemic and publish it in a medical or scientific journal, right? That's what we do. We do our science and then we disseminate it among our peers. And I read this analysis that said, on average, and this is really on average, right, across all the different journals that are out there, but on average, 12 people read to the end of a paper. And of course, as I'm saying, for some, it will be thousands of people will read it. For some, it will be even fewer than 12, depending on what you've written about and where it ends up. But I thought, wow, that's really depressing. Not only am I doing this difficult work that I want to share, but I'm doing really interesting work and I'm seeing things that are life and death that are very revealing and that I wish many other people knew about. So I'm on these reservations, I'm doing these epidemic investigations. And I say reservations because I happen to have a lot of outbreaks that I was sent to investigate specifically on American Indian reservations. Which had all sorts of their own issues in terms of like why those outbreaks were happening there. And one of the things that happened on the Navajo Nation is I got sent to investigate an outbreak of flesh-eating bacteria. So group A strep was causing necrotizing fasciitis. People were losing limbs, becoming septic, winding up in the ICU, and some people were dying from this infection. So I get sent there. And again, my focus is on the pathogen, right? Of course, I'm hearing all these rumors. There's this misinformation that's really preventing people from wanting to speak to me, which makes it very hard to do my job in terms of finding the index case and connecting all the dots between the different people who are affected. But at the same time, one of the early things that you do in an epidemic investigation is case finding. So in that case, we were going door to door on the reservation. We were going in teams, be like myself, some Navajo translators, some local epidemiologists. And we were asking people, do you have any of these symptoms? Because this disease starts off as a really mild rash. And we want to make sure we catch it early. Do any of your kids have these symptoms? Do you know anyone who might have been sick? We wanted to get to them before it got very severe and people wound up in the ICU. And I remember one morning, really early in the outbreak, knocking on the door of this young woman on the reservation and asking her these questions. And she said, no, I'm fine. My kids are fine. And her kids were very little. They were running around her feet. And she said, I'm really worried about my kids because I know someone who got very sick from this. So like, what can I do to protect my children? And I was like, in my head, I was thinking, that's the easy part. Like this epidemic investigation is very challenging, but I know what you need to know to protect yourself. So I said very, maybe smugly, I don't know, just very self-confident, while the epidemic is spreading, make sure that you and your kids have really, really, really good hand hygiene. Make sure you wash your hands with soap and water regularly. So wash your hands, wash your hands. And she looked at me and said, with what water? And I was like, oh my goodness, like where am I? I'd just driven 5 hours from Phoenix, past malls and Chanel boutiques and resorts into a place where people did not have running water, did not always have electricity, did not have flush toilets. And really that was why this outbreak was spreading, because people weren't able to wash their hands and they were getting severely sick. Prior to joining the CDC, I'd been working in a clinic in Botswana where I may have expected somebody to say something like that. I didn't expect it to happen within the US, even though tribes have sovereign nations. And I remember thinking, am I really naive? Is it because I'm British and I just, moved to America like a few months prior to that? Is it that I just, am I just naive and I didn't realize that was the conditions on many reservations? And then I was thinking, or do a lot of people know this? Like, do Americans know that this is the state of affairs on reservations? And do people just not care? And I thought, what can I do that will take my work beyond a journal, which maybe only 12 people will read, or however many, to a public audience? What can I do to use this information to get people to give a damn and to hopefully do something? And so I went to journalism school after that and became a medical reporter. And in talking about science communication, I think that's a bit of an extreme of the spectrum. I don't think anyone's asking you to leave your work and go back to school at this point, but I just want you to know where I'm coming from as somebody who was really, a field epidemiologist, really into applied epi. When I wasn't doing outbreak investigations, I was doing epi analyses and studies of long-term consequences of outbreaks and things like that. But it was really those kinds of experiences that made me think, as a public health physician, I don't know if I'm really doing enough to engage the public to talk about what's happening in public health. And in fact, things have changed at the CDC a little bit, but back then when I was at the CDC, the culture was that a good day at the CDC was one when we didn't get any freedom of information requests, when we didn't get any press coverage. I remember even thinking at the time, that seems a bit backward. We should be telling our story. We should be the ones managing that, that reputation. We are paid by taxpayers, so we should be giving back that information to say, here's what I do in my job, and here's what I've learned, and here's how your money gets spent. It did take me a bit back to my motivation for going into medicine in the first place, which is that I grew up in England in a very conservative immigrant Muslim community where throughout my childhood, I saw medical paternalism and medical elitism be harmful to my family's health and my community's health. There was such a massive power differential, right, between a healthcare provider, for example, and a patient. And I saw how that played out in very negative ways. And at first it made me want to have nothing to do with medicine. And then it made me think, no, I want to change this. I want the people who we care for to be involved in decision making. I want people to have that information that will allow them to make informed decisions about their health. And that's why I went into medicine. And I guess that second part of seeing what happened during these outbreaks was my aha moment from from just being a public health physician to being a public health physician and a medical journalist. And I think nowadays, it's funny, I just got off a call with a researcher at Stanford who wants my team to do some work with their center around communications. And increasingly this is happening because it's becoming a part of what grant requirements are. Some funding organizations are saying we need to see demonstrably how you have taken what you've accomplished, what your research finds into the wider community. What are you doing around community engagement? What are you doing in terms of how you're presenting your work to different audiences? That of course includes your peers, but it also has to include perhaps the public and the press. And so we're getting pulled into this a lot more. I hope it's not just because these are some requirements of grants. I hope it's because there's also this enthusiasm about breaking down that gap between those of us in ivory towers who are involved in knowledge formation and those people in our communities whose lives are impacted by either the healthcare services that we provide or whose lives are impacted by the science that we do. I'm very, very passionate about that. What I do now is a lot of research around misinformation and disinformation around health. It's what I started studying a few years ago when I first came to Stanford as a John S. Knight Fellow. And what I'm learning as I keep studying this is that in the same way that you see disparities in death rates from COVID, for example, or you see disparities in COVID-19 infection rates among different communities, that actually there are these disparities when it comes to information access and disparities when it comes to how engaged people might be with science and with scientists. Some of the work I'm doing now that I just got funded last week, is to look at kind of mapping that information inequity. The reason that that's so important to me is because that misinformation and disinformation seems to spread at a much greater speed and to a much greater extent in those communities that are disengaged from science and the scientific process. So I think especially, I'll give you one example. A few years ago in Minneapolis, And in other parts of Minnesota too, the state experienced its biggest measles outbreak in 3 decades. It was a really, really terrible measles outbreak, which primarily affected the Somali American community in and around Minneapolis. And what had happened prior to that, many years earlier, about a decade earlier, is Somali parents in that community started to worry that there might have been higher than average rates of developmental delay among their kids compared to their white peers. And so these concerns about developmental delay made their way to the public health department, which said and did what public health departments should do, which is, we're going to study this. We're going to look to see, are there higher rates of developmental delay, autism, disorders, things like that amongst Somali children in Minnesota. In the meantime, there were some other groups that got wind of these fears and anxieties, and these were anti-vaccine groups. They also included Dr. Andrew Wakefield, the discredited British doctor who lost his medical license in the UK because of his unethical research around the MMR vaccine. He now lives in Texas. I believe he's still in Texas. When I was a reporter at the Dallas Morning News, I know he was there, and he was loved by many. But his organization, other organizations heard about those Somali American families' concerns. They flew into Minneapolis. They held closed door town hall meetings with armed guards at the door so that journalists and public health folks could not get in. And over a period of time, they kept doing these town halls and saying to the families there that you're right to be concerned. There are higher rates of developmental delay amongst your children. And it's because you vaccinate and you get the MMR vaccine. Over the next decade, MMR vaccine rates, vaccination rates among Somali children went from about 94% to less than 50%. I think it was 42% in the end. And then, of course, that was the perfect storm, the situation where this awful measles outbreak happened. Then the public health department came along and said, we have some results for you. And this is like once the crisis is already hit. We've done our epidemiologic analysis, and we've learned that actually it may appear that developmental delay is occurring at a higher rate among Somali American children, but it's not. It's not higher. It's equal rates to their peers. By that point, the damage was done. And I wonder, in retrospect, if the public health organizations in the public health department, other local public health organizations could have engaged those families in a much more meaningful way to say, we can't rush science. We need to do our analyses in a particular way. We're going to be thorough. But instead of just saying hello to you, goodbye, and then we'll come back to you in 5 to 10 years with some data, once it's gone through IRB, once it's gone through peer review, we're going to bring you behind the scenes and have you understand the processes that we're going through to answer your question. I also think about those communities in the US, especially in the South, that have had high rates of TB. For example, a few years ago, there was a really bad TB outbreak in Alabama. And at the time, I remember my public health colleagues becoming very frustrated. They were saying that we're offering not even just free TB testing, but we're offering cash incentives for people to get tested for TB, and we can't seem to get people to come in. And this TB outbreak's the worst in like 100 years in the US, and we can't get it under control. All you had to do was look at Google Maps to see that where this TB outbreak was happening was about a 1-hour drive from Tuskegee, which up until 1972 was home of this deeply unethical study where Black men, sharecroppers, were left untreated with syphilis and lied to about their condition, even once we knew that penicillin could treat the infection. So you see how those historical legacies in this anecdote play out in modern times. And you see how it's being stoked now in terms of, we don't have a COVID-19 vaccine, but we do have some organizations, Nation of Islam, for example, and others, who are really exploiting those fears and that distrust amongst the Black American community, amongst Muslim communities, amongst different communities that have historical reasons for distrusting medical establishments and public health organizations. And my fear is that those communities are much more connected to their faith-based organizations than they are to their local scientists. And they may only see a local scientist on the news when that scientist is speaking in lots of jargon and maybe not speaking to the particular fears or anxieties of those communities who are most affected. So I hope that gives you an idea of like where I'm coming from. My personal motivations for going into medicine in the first place and for then going into journalism and communication are very much rooted in my belief that everybody deserves equal access to information about science and health, and that this big gap between scientists, healthcare providers, and the people that we serve is a dangerous gap. And it's often filled by people who are spreading very harmful information that exploits the fears, the concerns, and exploits that big gap between us and the communities that we serve. I said I wanted this to be interactive, so I hope it's okay to leave it there, open it up to questions, and to continue the discussion that way. But I'm happy to answer any questions you have about my journey, about the work I do now, or if you want to ask questions about concerns you have about doing more public-facing stuff, for example. I know you still have those presentations coming up about social media, about how to interact with the press, but I'm also happy to answer any related questions as somebody who is a journalist who does media training for scientists, and as a I'll admit it, I love social media. Like I said, I do the social media training for the medical students, but I also think that social media is a really, really useful tool for scientists. And I just see it being used in quite brilliant ways by a lot of people, especially during the pandemic.
Dr. Yasmin, we do have a question for you. Someone is asking, how do they reach out to journalists and the press if they have a story to share? How can they get in touch?
Great question. So it might depending on whether you have a piece of research that you've done. Maybe you know it's embargoed, but you want to get ahead of the curve. You want to give it to a journalist, letting them know that it has an embargo. It might be that you want to comment on something that's happening and you have particular expertise that you want to offer. The way to do it is to start connecting perhaps with local journalists if you can, national journalists if that makes sense to you. One of the best ways to do this, I think, and there are a few ways, but one way is to do it through a university communications department. Your own division or department may have a point person who will already have relationships with journalists. Universities at large do as well. Another great way, I think, is to interact with journalists who are on social media. Do this obviously if you already have a Twitter, Instagram account. I never force people to start using social media if they don't already enjoy it, because I think then it just becomes another thing to do. And I kind of don't like it when some departments make their researchers and their postdocs set up social media and have I don't know if it's happening at Stanford, but I've heard from others around the country that they even have rules in some departments that you need to tweet about our work 3 times a week. Maybe there's some benefit to that, but the way that I was taught about social media 6 years ago in journalism school was that it needs to feel genuine in order for it to be effective. So if you already are on social media, start following the kinds of journalists whose beat it is to cover your work, and then interact with them. You can DM them, you can find their emails. The thing is, even though it can feel a bit tricky sometimes to connect with journalists, they are desperate to find you. They need credible sources. They need content. They need people to write op-eds, to appear on radio shows, to give them sound bites for a radio interview, to give them a quote that they can use in a magazine or newspaper article. But I think some of the best ways are to do it either through the university spokesperson, the comms department, or to do it through your own social media accounts, doing that bit of research on who's the right journalist to connect with. Oftentimes when I do trainings about how to engage with the press, I'm not doing it in a crisis situation like this one. And actually what I say to people is there always will be a crisis. One is imminent at any given time. Make sure that you develop relationships with local journalists, especially before then. Of course, now we're in a crisis. I think it's fine. Journalists, as I said, they are desperate to find you, to connect with you, editors as well. And those are some of the ways that I think are quite effective.
Thank you so much. There was a quick follow-up, which was, can you share your Twitter handle? I think some folks may have missed it if you've shared it already.
Oh, no, I didn't share it. And I'm actually I don't normally plug myself on Twitter or anything like that, even though I really enjoy it. But if you do want to follow me or engage, it's at Dr. Yasmin with doctor spelled out. So DOCTOR Yasmin. And on Instagram, which Instagram is becoming increasingly used as a great tool for spreading really good COVID-19 information. You get these really good slideshows where people post something about testing and it kind of takes you through these 10 slides on testing. It's also becoming a hub of misinformation and disinformation, of course, but Instagram recently has been making some efforts at bringing that down. But if you are on Instagram and you want to see my posts on there, which are mostly of my dog and nowadays and poems, it's at Dr. Seema Yasmin.
I think everybody loves dog postings right these days. Just to keep on the social media theme, someone also asked another follow-up, which is, do you recommend posting from your own accounts or creating a separate account that you use solely for this kind of communication?
Yeah, great question. Ask 6 people who love social media. You may get 6 different answers, but I'll tell you what I think. I think it makes sense to do it from one account. If you see my Twitter, you will see that because it's August, many of us who are poets are doing this thing called the Seeley Challenge, where we read 1 book of poems a day. And so you'll see right now, I'll be posting poems and like what book I'm reading. My dog had surgery 6 weeks ago, so you will see pictures of her and how my mum is cooking for my dog at the moment. And then of course, you'll see loads of my tweets about COVID-19, whether it's like a paper that's come out that I really like and think people should read, whether it's a criticism of a headline because it's misreporting the data. So to me, the way that I was taught to use social media back in journalism school, and I think this was based on some evidence about better engagement, was that it should be 1/3 personal and 2/3 the kind of stuff we want to get out of it as scientists, as physicians, as providers. That works for me. Of course, there are days when it will just be dog pictures. There are days where I need to talk a lot about testing and I'll do that. But I think for me, it does make sense to do it from one account. You can always try that and then see what works for you. But I believe you'll get better engagement from people and your peers. If it's you. So there's one account and you're behind that. And so there's going to be personal stuff. And then there will be work-related tweets as well.
Thank you so much. There's a question here which I'm really interested in, so I'm going to promote it, which is, how do you communicate effectively around more theoretical topics and projects? So things like theoretical physics or chemistry that are maybe very abstract and far removed from kind of day-to-day lives of individuals.
Yeah. So when the first thing I thought of when I thought of this was, I teach this when I teach our journalism students at Stanford, it's one thing to write a story about a chipmunk, which isn't a human story, but it's a human interest. But then how do you write a story about an asteroid? And one of the ways that I show them some examples is of journalists who do it in a way where they connect it to the scientists doing the work. So even if it's so theoretical that it's not about an asteroid collision, or it's not about an asteroid that in any way is going to impact humans, we'll not be able to see it. There are scientists, there are people, there are humans who have dedicated their lives to studying that asteroid. Some of the best journalism peels back the curtain and of course tells us about the asteroid, but tells us about the story of the people who are studying it, what their frustrations are, what their most triumphant moments look like. Those become really engaging and fascinating. Like, I remember this one Washington Post story that starts off with, Dr. So-and-so has been searching for a rock, not just any rock. And it was all about this scientist at NASA who needed a particular size of asteroid. I hope that is the right thing and not another kind of, I don't know, a rock, but looking for a particular kind of asteroid to put a particular kind of device on. But from that first 4 or 5 words, you're like, wait, what? Someone's looking for a rock like up there. So I think it requires being creative, right? Because it doesn't on its surface look like a human interest story. But what you are communicating is something that you are really passionate about. And we want to know about that. Maybe it does have some impact on humans, but humans don't have to be the center of everything every time. Maybe there's a particular equation that's at the central to your research. There's a story behind that. So it's sometimes on the face of it does feel like, you're gonna have to be more innovative, more creative, but that's the fun part of it sometimes. And I think we sometimes don't want to read about humans actually. The public doesn't always want to be obsessed with ourselves or with animals. So just help us find that hook. And I think the best way to do this, and I teach my journalism students this, is don't sit at your laptop with your fingers like this, what is the story? I don't know why, but we always feel like we must sit in isolation and that creativity and inspiration will flow down our forearms. It won't. Have a conversation with somebody about it. Get somebody who's not in your field to ask you questions. Maybe those questions are, what do you do? What are you studying? And see what comes out of that. See what piques their interest. Oftentimes we're so deep, in the weeds with our work that we forget what might be interesting to other people sometimes. There are also interesting things you can do, like a format where you're a theoretical physicist. What you do is supremely complex, but you get, you have a challenge where you can do a video where you have to explain it to a plumber. You have to explain it to your grandmother, assuming your grandmother is not a theoretical physicist. She might be, it might be in the family. But those kinds of things can be really fun to watch, because then we're watching it not just to understand what you do, but like, how are you going to get this person to understand it, and why it does this really well. I do a lot of work for them, but I've suddenly gone blank on what it's called, but it's called something like 7 levels or something. And it's where they'll get a theoretical physicist to explain something to a 7-year-old, to an undergrad, to a postgrad, to their peer, something, like along those lines. So there's always ways to bring us into what makes you excited and to get us as excited.
Thank you so much. That was such a helpful answer. And I think that there's a question here, and that it seems a natural follow on as well, which is that journalists seem to look and engage with good storytellers. And I think you started to kind of hit on this, but are there suggestions you have for folks about how to become better storytellers, how to do a better job of just practicing their communication skills generally?
Yeah, this is what I teach. I love it. I think there's a science to this. There's an art to this. I think it can feel quite scary, right? Like, oh, how do I translate this paper into this whole other thing? An op-ed, a story, an animation, whatever, a tweet, a series of tweets. It's so much fun to think about the different ways you can bring that alive. I think one of the best ways to get good at storytelling is by reading good stories. That might be long form scientific reporting in Undark magazine or in The Atlantic, or it might be reading a young adult novel that's really science fiction-y and seeing how they bring that to life. It might be something not very related to science, but it's good storytelling. And the thing that's good then is when you've read something and you're like, that was killer, is to go back and try and underline the bits where you're trying to figure out the mechanics of it and why something worked very well. I teach storytelling, as I said, but I really think it's a process. You get better and better the more you do it, the more multimedia you become. You try and translate one thing from a paper to a series of tweets. You try and explain the same thing to your 11-year-old niece who maybe has an interest. You try it out in different ways and try different forms. I think you have things like Science Cafe or Café Scientifique, where it challenges researchers to have this like really informal pub or cafe-like scenario where you're engaging with folks in a really informal way. That's one forum where you can go and practice. But you have like the scientific equivalents of like the Moth now, like storytelling that's all about science. You also have, let me think, science stand-up, where people, merge their science with stand-up comedy. That stuff, it can be tricky, but it can also be really fun and kind of get you out of your head and engaging with people and forcing you to figure out ways to translate what you do to very different audiences. So it's just consuming stories, figuring out what works, what doesn't. If something works, why did it work? If something failed, why did it fail? And then trying it out.
Thank you, Dr. Yasmin. That was so helpful. There's some questions here, I think, that are kind of hitting on similar themes, which is, how do you deal, and you talked about the Andrew Wakefield case, which is, I think, maybe the most prominent or one of the most prominent misinformation scandals in science and sort of the anti-vax community, but there are others as well. How do you deal with when people are either bringing misinformation? How do you respond to those folks? Or, and thinking about it from a different campaign, when you're trying to kind of, like you were talking about, educate the public and kind of maybe not necessarily engage with the people who are spreading the misinformation directly, but try to correct the message and to send the truthful message. Do you have any suggestions for how to do that?
I teach a 6-hour class on this, but I'll try and condense it because I do think there are some like really central strategies that work. One thing we've learned over the years, and we've learned a lot of this from social psychologists, is when you have a very polarized environment, you have one person who has a fixed, very firm belief about one thing, another person who has a very different belief, pouring facts on top of that is like pouring kerosene onto a fire. This is a really important thing that I hope we acknowledge more and more, because often it's our approach in science is, oh, you believe this thing, that's so dumb, that's just so incorrect. I have evidence, I have facts, I have science behind me, which almost is a bit of a mischaracterization of science, given science isn't fact. Science is actually a process, right, of interrogation and inquiry. If we start framing science as solid facts, well, that's how we end up in a situation where people are now attacking Dr. Fauci, saying, but you said not to wear masks in April, and now you're saying we should all wear masks. And it's not because he doesn't know what he's talking about, it's because the understanding has shifted, among other things, among political and constraints around resources too. So I think it's really important to not just believe that you know something that this person needs to know and you must impart these facts, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point in your head that you need to get across. Actually, the first thing you need to do is be quiet and listen to what they are saying, as infuriating as that might seem, because you're like, oh my God, this is just like wrong. It can be really useful to ask a question about why they believe what they believe, how they came to believe it. And then this can take time, but sometimes not. Then try and find some common ground. Then try and find some consensus. So I often teach this in the context of what happens if you're a doctor or a nurse and you have a patient and the dad's like, the patient is a child, but the dad's like, I don't want to give my kid the MMR vaccine. I heard it's really dangerous. I heard it's got really high levels of mercury in it. The best thing then might be to ask them questions about where they came to believe that, why they believe it. It might lead you to a story about a next door neighbor whose son got vaccinated and something happened, but you need to understand that story and also really put a flag on the fact that the thing that you do have in common, the thing that you really, really, really agree on is that you care very much about that child's health. Nobody wants to put anything poisonous into that child's body. But I think until you do the listening, until you do that understanding, it's very hard to know what communication message to have, because that father might require a very different conversation to the next mother that comes in and doesn't want to get her kid vaccinated for some different reasons. And oftentimes, I'm using people who have anti-vaccine beliefs here as an example, but it can apply to many things. But we often view these people as a monolith, when actually there's so much nuance in there. You know, I described that Somali American community, they had a particular history in the US, they had a particular reason for being fearful versus those folks in Alabama who live very close. You know, there are these different reasons. In the context of doctors, you know, I wish I could ask, but I don't know if we can engage so much in this context, but I often ask people, do you know how long a doctor lets a patient talk for on average before interrupting them? And people will be like a minute or so, like is it a bit less than that? 11 seconds. Doctors let a person talk for 11 seconds on average before interrupting them. So when I'm teaching communication, not just to scientists, but to physicians as well, my first strategy, my first tip to them for being a better communicator is shut the hell up. Like, stop talking. And of course, everyone comes to communications trainings like, what do I need to say? How should I frame this message? How should this be structured? It's like, no, put everything down, zip it. Just listen. Listen to the person in front of you. Because if you don't understand why they have anti-science beliefs, if you don't understand why they are a staunch climate change denialist, you're not going to be able to counter that in any way.
This feels just like the natural follow-up, but there are questions here that I think are related, which is, you know, so you're talking about maybe people who've been disengaged with science and have been turned away from science. So how do you get people to be engaged with science? And then, like you were describing, science is a process, and right now we're living out where everyone is seeing the sausage getting made and seeing how messy it is. And so how do you communicate how around when scientific consensus changes, and just how do you explain to the public kind of this is very natural for the scientific process when it looks like people are saying inconsistent things?
Yeah, and it's scary for the public, right? Because it's like, wait, but this one scientist said one thing, you're saying something different. Or even during that Senate committee hearing a couple of Mondays ago, where Dr. Fauci got asked again about hydroxychloroquine. And as he was speaking, the person questioning him said, but it's a peer-reviewed study. And Dr. Fauci was like, but not every just because it's been peer-reviewed doesn't make it good science. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, during this whole crisis, crisis, not only are we having to manage people's fears and anxieties, but we're having to get people from here up to here in terms of scientific literacy. We're trying to do the work of so many decades where we have not been doing the work. I think the way that we get past that is by having conversations like this, to be honest, and having putting that responsibility on us a little bit as to asking ourselves, how do I engage? You know, so often the beginning of a scientific process is that question asking, that hypothesis setting. We do that just us. We often don't engage the people who might be affected. And for theoretical physicists or folks, like, I'd have to think more about how that could be more community oriented. But certainly in the context of science that does affect people's lives in a very, clear way, why aren't they at the table often? Why don't those folks why doesn't my auntie get to go? She speaks English about well enough to understand. She cares about science. She cares about her body. So I think it's really about bringing people to the table really early on. I think about it that, I'm not a biostatistician, I'm an epidemiologist. So at CDC, I was always reminded, don't engage a statistician when you're doing your analysis. Please engage a statistician right at the beginning. And I kind of learned that's a really important thing to do. Otherwise, they're going to be undoing so many of my mistakes at that point, right? The study wasn't even powered well enough to ask that question. I should have always invited them 6 months earlier. So I think the same approach needs to happen with the public. And even if you are doing stuff that feels very abstract, very theoretical, oftentimes our work is funded by the public in some way, right? So shouldn't they get a say in terms of what work gets done and what doesn't? I always think there's room there for more engagement, and we're often not even really trying very much, if at all, to engage the public. So I really think it starts there.
I think we have time for maybe just one last question, and I'll take one in the chat and kind of expand it to take this last point you talked about, which is to be engaging with the public effectively. I think people often think about having an entire online persona and portfolio and multiple platforms for engaging. And how much work do you think, how important is that, do you think, to creating kind of a presence for yourself online that is associated with maybe different social media accounts, maybe linked to your lab website, and maybe even has opportunities for the public to engage with you? Just sort of what you might have advice for out there for some of our PhDs and postdocs who are trying to sort of establish themselves out there as an academic.
Gosh, that just sounds like a whole nother job, doesn't it? Like setting up a public persona. I don't think it has to be that. Maybe that happens over time. Or maybe you're starting off and you're like, this is what I want to do. I'm going to put that time into that. But I think oftentimes it starts with just being more accessible to the public. I have to think about ways we can do that. But my kind of dream is that the people around us get to have coffee with their local friendly scientist, assuming we are all friendly and having a good day. But you know what I mean? Like just that kind of, I know what a scientist looks like, as opposed to science is a thing that is thrust upon me. And it tells me to do a thing. It tells me to wear a mask, for example, right? Or the government uses science to make a law. Is so detached and so unfun, right? Science is just, it is at the heart of it. It has to be fun. And it's so much failure, which is depressing. So people should be buying us more coffee and tea. But that's where I want us to start off. It's more at that grassroots level. Doesn't involve making a website. Of course, the question then is, how do you do that? But I wonder if our departments can help us with that. I wonder if our departments, especially once we can do more in-person stuff, can go into a local mosque and have scientists are coming and you can ask them questions and they can ask you questions. They're going to stay for about an hour. Like, I wonder if we can do more of that, start up more conversations that way. Because I just think that now we're catching up with the lack of scientific literacy, and just knowing who a scientist is, what they do, what their job entails, knowing that science often begins with a question or with a 6-month-long grant writing process. Like all of that, I think would go a long way to bridging those gaps.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin. And it just makes me think of that classic Sesame Street about the people in your neighborhood. And a scientist is a person in your neighborhood, right? I love the idea of putting us out there and getting, just making scientists more part of the community so that everybody sees and recognizes that it's, like you said, that it's not something that's thrust upon you, that it's something that's happening all around you all the time. So.
And there's a really good question that we probably can't get to because, yes, I think we're out of time. But please do ask that question in the social media stuff too. But somebody's asking a question about that fine line between a person who wants to be a true public servant, like, hey, I do science, I'm a bit of an introvert, but okay, once every 2 months I'll come out of the lab and I'll, tell you a bit about the frogs I study or something, versus a person who's like, yeah, I want all the public platforms and I want to be the spokesperson for my field and I know everything. Oh my goodness, do we have those people right now in epidemiology and public health? Unfortunately, they also turn out to be quite big bullies as well. But I mean, I think those people create a lot of enemies. I would say don't do that. I don't think you would. The fact that people are asking these questions about, like, egos just get in the way. I think what we're trying to do is peel back the curtain on our processes, right? On what happens at an IRB, during peer review, in our lab, when we're writing grants. Sorry, grants are on my mind because I'm knee deep in writing proposals at the moment. But I think most of us veer towards that. Of course, we're human, so there are some really unethical scientists. There are some scientists who just want to get paid off this and get jobs and stuff like that. I think you can tell who they are, though. I think most of us can tell who they are. It's not very pleasant to be around them or to engage with them.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Yasmin.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope this is useful. And folks can find my Stanford profile online. If you have any follow-up questions that we didn't get around to, you can just email me or tweet me.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I was sitting here smiling and laughing and nodding my head and all along with you. So I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you.
So thanks so much. I would like to remind everyone who is watching that we will be starting the next presentation at the top of the hour again. In the meantime, if you're hanging out with us for the whole time, and you have some ideas, maybe this has sparked some other ideas for you about things that we might be able to do events for in the future. The link is up on the screen now that you can go to make suggestions to us about topics that you're interested in that we might be able to pull together for a future event. And we will be back at 2 o'clock. I did want to mention, you were saying about the online presence. There is a session tomorrow morning about creating an online portfolio for communicating your research. And I happen to know the women who are doing that session, and they are amazing and they do a spectacular job. So I highly recommend that one. And I'll be, in fact, I can show it to you briefly. I'll tell you about it. It's this session at 10 o'clock with Helen Chen and Janae Cohn. So, that's right. And we'll be hanging out here in the meantime, and we'll start up again at the top of the hour. Again, thank you, Dr. Yasmin.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Joining us? Here we go. Thank you for joining us for this session of GearUp for Research Communication, brought to you by Stanford Science and Engineering Libraries and the Lane Medical Library. I'm Amy Hodge, Science Data Librarian for Stanford Libraries, and I'm your host for this afternoon session. The theme for our event this year is research communication. At this event, individuals from across campus will share effective methods and unique ideas for communicating the meaning and significance of research. We hope you'll take away some ideas on how to amplify your research impact. This session is being recorded, as most of you just heard, and will be posted on the GearUp website after the event. If you have a question for the speaker, please type your question in the Q&A box. Your question will then be read out by our wonderful chat moderator, Ashley. The chat feature is open. I should have said Q&A moderator. The chat feature is open, but we will not be responding to questions placed in the chat window. So you can talk amongst yourselves, but if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A. At the end of the talk, we will post a link where you can suggest topics for future events. And that's it. So thank you very much for attending this session. Right now, we are pleased to welcome Luigi Longobardi, who is the executive editor at AIP Publishing, who is going to be talking to us about how to write a successful scientific paper. So I will stop sharing. I assume that you have slides.
Yes, I do.
To share. Great.
Share my screen. Okay. I think you can see my screen now, correct?
Yes.
Okay, let me just... well, first off, I want to thank you so much for inviting me to present at this event. Of course, a few months ago, I was very excited to come visit Stanford. I was getting in touch with scientists to, talk about their research together with this. But this works great anyway. And this is a subject, how to write a successful scientific paper. It's something I've been working on for a while. I'm always excited to talk about this. And my approach, the way I got to think about scientific papers has, a long history. I started in the early 2000s. I was an undergraduate. I was doing research, and I started writing papers at that time. And there is going to be it's going to be part of the story I tell today. My first paper is going to be part of this story. And then I did, what most scientists do. I went for a PhD in the United States on quantum technologies. I did postdoc positions. I wrote papers over all this time, and then I started reviewing papers. So I was looking at papers as an author for a while with mixed success. Then I started looking at papers as somebody who had to advise an editor about the paper. And then eventually I became an editor. And so at this point in time, my eyes opened. I started looking at the paper with a complete different perspective. I was now advocating for the readers. So I was looking at the paper on, can a reader understand this? Is this going to be impactful? Does it have reach? And so I started, and I started looking at the kind of papers I was getting and how can I help the authors make them better? And so that's kind of part of the story today. How are we going to, what can we do to improve them? What is that makes a paper better? And so today I'm really going to be looking at 3 questions. We're going to start with the why. What is the purpose of a scientific paper? We're going to be looking at the structure of a good paper. And then I'm going to give a couple of examples of how you can make it better, how you can improve it, make it more accessible to a broader audience. And I should have plenty of time for questions at the end. Really hope so. So let's start with question 1. What is the purpose of a scientific paper? The first part, well, step back, what's the goal? And the goal is to share science. You can share your own original research work with other scientists, or you can review the research conducted by others. And either type of content is there to help the evolution of modern science, which is for one scientist to build upon the work of others. And so how do you accomplish this goal? Well, how do you make it more accessible? You want to get the broader audience to pay attention to your message, and you want to get the broader audience to read your paper. And I'm going to say that to be accessible, your paper needs to have these components. It needs to be informative, clear, accurate, and concise. And what this really means is that your paper must communicate effectively. Well, the idea is that if you may have the greatest result ever, but if you don't communicate it effectively, that result can go unnoticed. Editors may not be specialists in your field, may not really understand the value of the paper, and may pass on it. We make mistakes. I've made mistakes. So help us not make those mistakes. And your readers may also not understand your paper and not cite it. So your paper ends up in this void of, we produce way too many papers today, way too many go unnoticed, not because the result was not important, it's because the author didn't communicate it effectively. A little bit more on this, how do we do it? Well, the trick to effective communication is to get your message across. So if you think about how you're gonna structure it, how you're gonna do your research, you certainly, these are the 3 components I see in good papers. The first component is the information. Every author is very good at this. This is about what I've done in the lab, what theory I've developed, what tools I've used, what is my result. Every author knows this to a T, enjoys writing this part of the paper, and every paper has this component. For your paper to be valuable, you need to spend time understanding the value of what you have found out and distill it into a message. So you need to interpret your result, distill it into a message, communicate that message, and you need to ensure that your message is written in a way that can call for action. And the action can either be what you plan to do next with your science. You know, I've reached this point by doing my current research, and next I will address this other problem. Or you may call upon others. Now the open question is, and that calls for others to follow on your footstep and do your research and do more research. If you think about it from a communication point of view, the information is the what of your paper, and every specialist in the field will want to know the what, because if they want to replicate your result, they need to know what you have done and what your conclusion is. When you interpret your results and you distill a message, you are answering the question, so what? You are telling your audience why is it important. Right? I have done this experiment and I have found this result. Okay, so what? Give that answer to your audience. That's gonna make your paper more interesting to a broader audience. And the action is the now what. Okay, now that I've obtained this result and I've told you why is it important, here are the next steps. This part, the message, is really the key element of an impactful paper. And I have seen on my desk way too many papers that don't have this. And so I've really thought a lot about how can I help my authors write this better. And that's part of what we're going to be talking today. So the effective communication is getting your message across. So what you want to do is get your audience to understand the message, pay attention to the message, be able to act upon the message. And the new keyword I've introduced here, although I've used it before, is audience. So let's start thinking, who is our audience? Who do we want to read our paper? And I would say, usually you have two primary audiences. You have the specialists and you have the non-specialists. Specialists are experts in the field. This audience requires all the relevant content, all the technical details to be able to validate your conclusions. You certainly want to write with this audience in mind, because before your paper gets to readers, the paper has to be peer reviewed, and referees belong to this group. Non-specialists, they require more context to understand your paper. You really need to give this audience the motivation, the background, and you need to spend a lot of time interpreting your result so that they understand why it's important to them. And I belong to this group. Editors belong to this group. So you want your paper peer reviewed so that it can be read. Before the paper is peer reviewed, it has to make it past me. So you definitely want to write with me in mind. If you look at this, I guess it's not a surprise that your specialists really need to know the what of your paper, and the non-specialists are really interested in the so what. So, answering the first question, what is the purpose of a scientific paper? Well, the paper must get the message across. It must convey the so what so that your audience can understand why the work is relevant and important. So now let's look at the structure of a paper. And I call it the architecture of a scientific paper. And I really like quoting this gentleman here. Say, prose is architecture, non-interior decoration. And I really enjoy Hemingway's style of writing. But what really sets a scientific paper aside, there is one of the books I use when I prepare this presentation. It says, a paper is the art of artless prose. It's usually very dry. So what really it's important for a paper is It's its structure, it's how you build it. It's what architecture you follow. And I advocate, since this is a science audience, science and engineering audience, most scientific papers follow this IMRAD structure: introduction, material and methods, results and discussion. I advocate you use this structure for your own paper. And if you look at this structure, you can easily identify that you as an author really care a lot for your materials and method, for your result and discussion, because that's the work you have done. You have spent a lot of time building your experiment, finding your sample, doing your experiment, understanding your results. That is the part of the paper you are going to write very fast. But that's not the part, and again, the specialists also need this, but the majority of your readers really care about the introduction and the conclusion. They really care about putting the paper in context and what the main finding is. And another issue with this structure is that many first-time authors, especially, but even more experienced authors do this, tend to write their paper chronologically. They are pretty much giving us all of the elements, and they are setting the stage to, in the end, surprise us and shock us with their great conclusion. They are like creating suspense to the big reveal of what their result is. And this is an enjoyable style of fiction writing if you're writing a mystery novel. But if you do this for the generic scientific reader, you are not doing yourself or them a favor. They're not prepared. They prefer to know your main outcome up front. They prefer if your structure is not chronological, so that they can look through the paper for those clues. They know what your conclusion is, and they can identify when they read your materials and methods and your results and your discussion, they can see and identify that it all makes sense with the conclusion in mind. So how do you break this chronological order? You can do it in the abstract. And what I'm advocating is that the abstract should have components from both the introduction and the conclusion. And I'm assuming everybody knows, but let me just repeat to you that the abstract is really a global paragraph. It prepares the reader for the rest of the document. You should write it with all audiences in mind. It should have a summary of what's in the paper and what the findings are. And it should really allow the reader to decide if the paper is of interest to them, and so if it's worth continue reading. So again, it helps break the chronological structure of the paper by telling the reader all that they need to know before they engage with the rest of the paper. The abstract I suggest is divided into a foreword and a summary. The foreword kind of tells you what was there before you did your research, and the summary tells you what you found, what's next, so it's the after. In the foreword, you would put the context, you would tell readers what they need to know to understand the need for the research you have conducted. The need motivates the audience by detailing what knowledge gap you are trying to fill. What is your research question that you are addressing? The task is what you have done. The experiment, the theory you have developed, that's the task you have accomplished. The object tells us what the paper contains. In this paper, I report. And in the summary, you will tell us the finding, so what you have found as a result of executing the task. And then you would give us some conclusion and perspective. So what these findings mean to the reader and what needs to be done in the future. So if you think about it, the task and the findings are kind of author-centric. What I've done and what I found. Context and need, conclusion and perspective are reader-centric. and the object is paper-centric. So, and another way to look at this is that your forward is not just the before, it also gives us a motivation. It should help the reader answer the question, do I care? Is this important to me? While the summary should have all the messages, so you put them there right at the beginning of your paper. You know what your message is, you tell us right away. And it helps the reader answer the question, do I need more? By writing the abstract this way, you should be able to make your paper attractive to non-specialists. So you should be able to have a broader readership, also by experts in other fields. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this part of the talk is the title. The reason I talk about the title last is because the title should be a summary of the paper at a glance. And for you to write a summary of the paper at a glance, you should write the abstract last. That's why it's last. And now, if the title is a summary of the paper, and I argue that the paper must communicate effectively, well, then the title also must communicate effectively. And I would advocate that you need to make sure your title has those keywords that makes it easily discoverable. You should try to have your title kind of search engine optimized, if you will. And so step back of what I told you before about communicating effectively. It means really that the title must also, like the paper, must be informative, clear, accurate, and concise. I'm gonna expand a little on this. Informative, you want your title to state what has been shown, the so what, and not just what has been done, the what. You want it to be clear, so you want it to be simple enough so that non-specialists can understand it. Accurate, there should be enough details so that the specialists can understand what niche in their specialty you are filling, you are addressing. And concise, you could say about 100 characters or less. I'm negotiable on this. Could be longer, but not too long. People don't really want to spend a lot of, reading a long title really doesn't help attract readers. So answering the third question, the second question, what is the structure of a good paper? As I said, I advocate use the IMRAD structure, but do not write chronologically. Tell your readers up front what is the main outcome, what is your message, and structure your abstract and title for effective communication. Okay, the last part, how can I make my paper accessible to a broader audience? This is the part that I really have a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun putting it together. I had a lot of fun presenting it. It kind of exposes me because I use my very first paper that I wrote as an undergraduate as an example of what you should absolutely not do. So, and one thing I do when I give this talk in person, I usually at this point distribute, I give papers to the audience. I ask you to look at it. And then I ask, okay, what did you look at first? And obviously with this format, I cannot do this, but I'll tell you in previous occasions, the answers I get is, I look at the title, the abstract. Some tells me I looked at the conclusion, if the abstract was not written the way I advocate it should. And then people look at figures. And so when I thought about writing a talk on improving papers, okay, let's focus on those components. How can I improve a title? How I improve the abstract? How do I improve figures? So we're gonna look at the examples. And as I said, this is the example I'm going to use, not for the figure, for title and abstract, is the first paper I ever wrote. I was an undergraduate student. I had just defended my senior thesis. My advisor sent me to a hyperlocal conference where I presented a poster. And with that poster, I was given the opportunity to write a paper for an international journal. And so that's the paper I wrote. I gave it to my advisor to look at it and returned with minimal corrections. I had no experience at the time, so I thought, I was also very arrogant, so I thought, of course, there are no corrections. My writing is perfect. And, well, okay, I was wrong. So the advice here is really, if there are advisors in the audience, and okay, this is Stanford, so I don't expect any professor there to their students, really pay attention to the draft they give you. And the students in the audience, if you write your first paper, or even your second, third, fifth paper, and you get minimal feedback, advocate for yourself. Go back to your advisor, ask for more. They probably didn't pay enough attention. There is no way your first paper is perfect. Okay, so now that I've pontificated, this is the first title of the first paper I ever wrote. RF squid-based devices for MQC. Let's see, does it check the boxes? Is it informative? It doesn't state what has been done or what has been shown. So no, this is not an informative title. Is it clear? Non-specialists could not understand it. Nobody really understood what my paper was about. Is it accurate? It doesn't have enough details to be understood by a specialist. Literally, nobody understood this paper, nobody cited this paper. It went into the void. Well, the one thing I was negotiable about, concise, this title has. This is a concise title. So it clearly doesn't do the job. So let's fix it. I'm going to say technical terms are okay for both specialists and non-specialists, but acronyms may be accessible only to a small circle of specialists. So let's avoid them. Let's start with RF squid. What is an RF squid, and can we be more general? And you ask me, I worked with this stuff for a good portion of my career. It was my bread and butter. I'll tell you, an RF squid is a superconducting quantum interference device. It's a Josephson device. In its simple realization, is a superconductive loop that's interrupted by a Josephson junction. I can go on telling you what Josephson devices and junctions are, but the point here is it's a Josephson device. That's already a much broader term. There is a lot of people working in Josephson devices. Replace RF squid with this, your paper now already has a larger reach. What's MQC? MQC stands for macroscopic quantum coherence. Even specialists had a hard time understanding that. And the reason specialists had a hard time understanding it is that it was an acronym we used a lot in my lab. It was hyperlocal. We, among ourselves in the lab, understood what we meant, but it wasn't clear to anyone outside the circle. So it's jargon. You should never use jargon. Avoid at all costs. Just spell it out. So you get this title: Josephson devices for tests of macroscopic quantum coherence. This is already good. It's easier. You can discover it. We could stop here. It does not convey the message. And so maybe we can take it a little further. Let's ask the question, what was done? Why did we do it? So we designed different device configurations. We played with geometry. Why? Well, because macroscopic quantum coherence is sensitive to thermal current and magnetic field fluctuations. It's sensitive to all these things that are considered noise. And we discovered that with optimal design, we can minimize these effects. Well, that's the so what. Optimal design can minimize the effect of noise. And so you can actually write your title as design optimization improves the noise response in Josephson devices for tests of macroscopic quantum coherence. This would be great. It has everything it needs to have. I would also tell you, again, going back to what I told you earlier, write with your readers and your audience in mind. So while I think that this is a good title, it's not concise per se anymore, but it works. Keep in mind who you are writing for. Different fields like having the message. So in some fields, they like having this kind of title that tells you the so what. Other fields are more dry. They like having the what. So they like this way of writing titles. And so here, and I'm not asking that everybody reads everything. It's a dense slide. I'll tell you, the titles in red here come from physics. The titles in green, it's biology or it's biology. In blue, it's chemistry. And in gray, it's environmental and earth and environmental science. And if you look at this, and I have 3 examples for each, you don't have to read them all, but you can notice that physics and chemistry really like the what-based titles. So if you are in one of these fields and you don't feel comfortable putting your message, your so what in the title, that's okay. That's how your field works. If you can work it in, I think you're gonna be more successful, but you don't have to follow my recipe to a T. Keep in mind, your field doesn't really like this. These other fields like having the so what. They like having the message in the title. So it's to your advantage. Conforming to the field is something you should do, and your title then would be powerful, would be impactful. Now, going back to the abstract, I put this slide here just to remind you my recipe for the abstract. And again, what the abstract is a mini version of the paper, should tell you what has been done, why. It should be important to the readers so that they can decide if they need to keep on reading the paper. You write it in a certain way because you want your work to be picked up by editors and disseminated. And here is another information. For me, I work in publishing, so I know this. When I ask a referee to review your paper, the referee receives a letter from me. And in the letter, they are told the title of the paper, they are told the authors, and they receive the abstract. If the referee decides, I want to review this paper, that's when they get access to the rest of the paper. So your abstract helps the referee decide if they want to review your paper. So that's another reason your abstract should be easy to be understood. So let me give you a general example. So, excuse the pun here, but in the abstract, telling you that an abstract should contain context, need, task, object, findings, conclusion, and perspective, maybe not an easy concept to grasp. So let me give you what I call a generic example. So context, this is a really generic example. You can probably use it as a template for your future papers. Context, the study of F is important because reason, crucial to our understanding of F is a measurement of X, because this has the potential of revealing a property of F. Need, in the past, this has been very difficult to accomplish because a reason. So task, we developed a technique that allows for higher precision measuring of X using a combination of 2 factors, M and N. Object, this paper reports a full account of our approach. Findings, we applied methodological information of M and N to a system, and we found some insight property of F, which demonstrate some conclusions we found about F. Conclusion and perspective, our approach involving this combination of M and N can also be applied to some other system, R, and this may lead to further insight concerning F and its development. So this is a concrete example of an abstract that contains all of the ingredients. Going more into a real life example, let's go back to my first paper. I wrote a very short abstract here. And if I break it down to you, this abstract only has 2 of the 6 or 7 components I gave you before. It tells you the task that we did, that we created the different geometries of devices for macroscopic quantum coherence and how these geometries work together. And it tells you our finding. So we report some data on the performance of the device and measurements of this decay from the metastable state. But even in the finding, I'm not telling you why these findings are important. So many important components are missing here. And the real issue is that this is self-centered. I told you, finding and task are author-centric. And that's all that was here. It was all about me. So this is a self-centered abstract. It focuses on what is interesting to me. It gives no context, gives no explanation of the need for the research, leaves out the conclusions, and it does not tell readers why their paper is important to them. It's not effective, it doesn't communicate well, it's not impactful. No wonder this paper got 0 citations. So can we fix it? Well, yes, we can. So here is a possibility to rewrite this abstract. Let's give some context. A quantum computer. So you didn't know my research was important to quantum computation. A quantum computer will require quantum bits, qubits. So now you know. These qubits need to have good coherence that can be coupled together to form logic gates. Quantum computing based on Josephson junction technology is considered promising due to its scalable architecture. That's your context. Need. However, the coherence due to noise is a major obstacle. Task. We developed different types of integrated Josephson devices where the qubit is a RF squid and the readout is performed by a magnetometer, which is another kind of squid. Object. Here we outline details on the design and fabrication of the device in 2 different geometries. Findings. We report data on the device performances as well as preliminary results on the decay from the excited qubit state. The data show evidence that the gravity-geometric configuration minimizes the effect of electromagnetic noise. Conclusion and perspective. These results show that optimal design can improve the response to external noise in qubit based on Josephson technology and are an encouraging first step towards demonstrating quantum coherence. So now this should allow a reader to decide if the paper is important to them and if they need to read the rest, and it puts it into context. It tells you why it's relevant. Last, figures. So as I said, many readers check the abstract and the figures first. So in a good paper, the figures should help getting the message across. The caption must contain important information, and the figures and captions together should tell a story. So the one example I'm going to give today is about improving a figure caption. And here I have a figure from a paper that was published in a journal in the AIP portfolio, so I have the rights to show this figure. And if the caption to this figure was measurement setup, this is a caption that contains no information. You don't have to be a specialist in the field. If you are an experimentalist, but you don't even need to be an experimentalist, you can tell that this is an experimental or a measurement setup. So this is not an effective caption. Your caption needs to have a message. You don't really want your reader to go between the paper and the figure to understand what they are seeing in the figure. And so here I'm giving you an example, which I'm not going to read, of an expanded caption. And in this caption, we give details of where the experiment was performed. This was a dilution refrigerator. It goes to very low temperatures. What kind of signals we sent to the device. There are microwave signals, there are lasers. How those lines were filtered, how did we remove noise? The authors removed noise from the device, and how the readout was performed. So if you are a specialist in the field, now you have all the information, you understand this fully. And if you're a non-specialist, you get some out of it as well. Okay, so that's the one example I wanted to give. So answering, how can I make my paper accessible to a broader audience? Focus on the areas most important to the readers. Improve your title and abstract, and ensure that your figure captions contain a message. So here you have my 3 questions and my 3 answers. So let me give you my conclusion. I gave you 3 answers to 3 questions to improve your approach to writing papers. I argued that if you communicate effectively and make sure that your paper is accessible to non-specialists, your paper is more likely to be understood by the editors, who will send it to the referees, and by experts in other fields, who will read it, understand it, act upon it, and cite it. I'm an editor, I focus on citations. The progress of science is not based on citations. So the important thing is that your paper becomes relevant to the progress of science. And I would really exhort you to use some of the tips I give you today to write better and more impactful papers. So if you look at my conclusions, 3 answers to 3 questions, that was the what of what I presented today. My second conclusion is the so what. That's my message to you. And the third conclusion is my call for action. That's my now what. And I hope you have a great career. I hope you write great papers. And when you are ready, you can show them to me. I would love to hear from you, see your paper. So you can email me and you can reach out on Twitter. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Longobardi. That was so helpful and I think inspiring to all of our audience who's looking to write better papers and hearing from an editor. That kind of feels like we got a lot of inside advice straight from the expert. I think the first question we have, and I think this is probably one that's on a lot of people's minds, is, so you've given us a lot of ideas, but do you have any suggestions for more resources we could use to follow up? Do you have any advice, or either books or websites, or even a series of maybe kind of writing exercises that would help people to get better at communicating?
Yeah, so I can give there are some of the resources I personally have used putting together this presentation. There is an editor, so the SPIE, which is a Society on Optics and Photonics, one of their journals editor, Chris Mack, wrote a book. I wish I remember the title, but it's a book on writing scientific papers. And this book really came from a collection of collection of editorials he wrote for his own journal. And then he put it together and made a book. The book can be purchased, but the PDF is free, can be downloaded. So if you research, I can email you those references later for or anyone can email me. But if you research writing scientific paper, Chris Mack, you should find the PDF of the book. It's freely available. Other things I've used, there is this journal, ACS Energy, from the American Chemical Society. Their editor-in-chief also wrote a series of editorials that are exquisite on how to write great papers. And editorials are usually in front of the paywall, so can be read by everyone. That's another resource. What my colleagues in Nature, they also have spent a lot of time, and actually they have a blog that was developed years ago with a communication specialist on writing papers. And so that's another free resource that people can use.
Thank you so much. And we have added a couple of us have added to the chat a link to Chris Mack's book. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for that resource. That was really helpful. Mm-hmm. So I think I, as a reader, will admit that I often turn to the figures first when I pick up a paper. And you talked a bit about how to improve the captions. Do you have any suggestions about how to improve the figures themselves, or advice about how to communicate better with figures?
No, here's the problem. You give me a figure, and I will tell you. In the abstract, it's really hard to tell you. But yes, I do. And actually, that's another book. This one is for pay, unfortunately, but I don't remember the title of the book. But if your audience can research Jean-Luc Dumont, he's the communication expert that helped Nature create their blog, and he works with this company Principie, and this website is principie.de. They're Belgium based. He wrote a book, and in the book he talks about how to give better presentations, how to write better papers, how to improve your figures. He spent a lot of time on this and gives concrete examples. Book is a little pricey, so maybe the library may want to have it, since I'm talking to librarians. But
thank you. No, we will look into that. And I think your point about that it's hard to kind of know in the abstract, I think that's an excellent point, to sort of that you'll know when you see it. And so maybe a different kind of question to ask is, and as an editor, what is an aspect of a paper that you would come across that would make you reject it at the desk? What is in your decision making that has you do a desk reject versus sending it out, as you said, to referees to get their opinion about it?
I actually, in a larger version of this presentation, I have a fourth question, which is exactly this. So editors really look at four things. One is the paper in scope within the journal? That's on the author. If you send me a paper that's not in scope, you didn't do your homework. We look at validity, but usually the validity question is it's something we kind of skirt on. We leave that to referees mostly. We look at significance and we look at importance. Those are the two things. And when I talk about the abstract and I talk about the need of the research, that's what I have a team of other people that work under me, and that's what I ask them to look for my journal. And keep in mind, my journal has an impact factor 17 for what matters, but it just means we have a much higher bar to desk reject. And what we really look for is we need to know why you did your research, what the need was. And then once we find the need, because not all papers come in with that kind of structure. The papers we accept, going back to the previous question, we rewrite and help the authors rewrite the abstract with this recipe. We rewrite their title and we give them suggestions for figures and captions. But we look for the need. We don't necessarily reject the paper because we cannot find it. If we think the paper has promise, we dig very deep for the need in the paper. And then we help you make it surface. But that's really what needs to, once we find the need, we do a lot of background research to see that the advance you propose is truly significant. So those are the two real important ingredients. You're missing a significant advance, or you are altogether, there was no need for your paper, we reject it.
Let's turn to the other side of the publication cycle. So we've had a paper successfully published in one of your journals. How do we communicate that paper and those findings to people maybe outside of our specialized fields? And as you said, how do we get those citation metrics? How do we get people to read and cite our work?
Yeah, so we do ourselves some of the work. So most of, and again, because I have the privilege to work with the flagship journal of my publisher, so more resources are given to us. Most of the papers we publish are either picked up for a press release, so we recommend it to our media team, and then they are picked up for a press release. Sometimes we coordinate with the publication office with the institution, because sometimes those press releases are initiated by the institution. And so in some cases we have this. In other cases, we have our own product internally. We call it SciLight, so Science Highlight. We have scientific writers write a 500 words summary of your paper. We promote that. And last, we as editor promote, because we are interested in promoting your papers, we promote it on our social media. We strongly encourage researchers do as well. So one thing you certainly can do yourself is to use your own Twitter. Usually we tweet at the authors and we tweet at the institution, and those tweets are then picked up by the authors and the institution, so they get propagated. But again, really, if you think about it, the way I suggest writing the abstract, it's almost like writing a popular summary of your paper. So once you write it that way, your paper becomes more discoverable. You can use your own writing to tell people what you have done. You kind of have already done the work in simplifying your research.
Thank you, Dr. Longobardi. I'm looking to see, I don't see any more questions waiting to be answered. And I think that you've set us up very well, because our next panel event that will be starting at 3 is talking about using social media to promote your research. So I think for all of you who are interested, you can take Dr. Longobardi's advice and just stay tuned for that panel and see how they recommend that you use those channels to promote your research. And I think I will turn it back over to our MC.
I just want to say it's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. I have to say, I very much resonated with me as someone who has published science papers and read many not so good science papers. The point about it, there shouldn't be like a surprise ending or whatever. that one really hit home for me. Oh, right, people want to know that, how it turns out up front, and the ability to evaluate everything that you say based on sort of those conclusions that you're trying to draw. That really struck home for me personally. So, though I don't anticipate needing to write a scientific paper again for a while anyway. And thank you so much. And we really appreciate it. I think this was really useful, really helpful, and I'm very glad that we have it recorded so that people who couldn't make it today will be able to watch. I wanted to put this slide back up again to let everyone know that we have one more session starting at the top of the next hour. That's 3 p.m. here Pacific time, our panel on using social media to promote research. And in the meantime, we have some great people on that panel, but in the meantime, one slide forward, I think, is the link for you again, if you weren't here before, to provide us with some ideas about topics that you'd like us to cover at a future event, or a future GearUp or some other event. We're happy to try to put together useful things for you. So we will be quiet for a little while, and then we will hopefully see you all again at the top of the next hour. There we go. This meeting is now being recorded, and it will be up on the GearUp website after the event. If you have a question for the speaker, please type it in the Q&A. Your question will then be read out by the Q&A moderator, or passed along to Gabrielle, I think, for them to share. The chat feature is open, but we will not be responding to questions that are placed there. So you can talk amongst yourselves in the chat, but that's not where we're looking for your questions. At the end of the presentation, we will post a link where you can suggest topics for our future events. And I want to thank you all very much for attending this session today. This particular session is our panel discussion on using social media to promote research. Our panel moderator is Gabrielle Karampoulos, Director of Communications and Development for Stanford Libraries, and she will be introducing all of the panelists for the presentation. So I'm handing it over to Gabrielle.
Great, thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. I'm really looking forward to moderating a great discussion with 3 wonderful colleagues from across campus, and so Without further ado, let me please welcome all three of you. Sarah Balaki, she's the Associate Director of Digital Engagement for the School of Engineering. We have Tui Dam, the Communications and Outreach Manager for Chemistry. And last but certainly not least, Nicole Kruvek, the Communications Manager for the Center for Ocean Solutions. Welcome, everyone. As Amy, just to reiterate Amy's point, please, if you have questions, we're going to start a little bit of a dialogue, and if anything spurs a question, go ahead and enter it into the Q&A at that time. We will leave time after a few questions that we have prepared, and we'll answer your questions directly after that. So with that, are we ready to jump in, ladies? All right. Then let's start with a baseline kind of question that just gets everybody oriented with an opportunity for you to introduce your social media channel and how you leverage those channels professionally. I guess the first rule of thumb is don't be shy to promote your content, right? So go ahead. How about if we, Sarah, start with you, Nicole, and then Tweet.
Awesome. I will unmute myself. I want to start off by just saying thank you so much for having me. This is a fantastic event, and I feel excited to be a part of it. And hello to everybody who's watching. I will go ahead and answer Gabrielle's question. I work as the Associate Director of Digital Engagement for the School of Engineering. So I actually oversee the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I will include YouTube in there for now as a part of our social media mix for the School of Engineering. We use our social platforms to distribute and attempt to extend the reach for our research at the school. And we do that through a number of research stories. We have a couple of writers on staff who are tasked with writing research stories regularly to cover the work that's happening at the school. And we also write a number of what we call school news stories, which cover kind of more of like the programs at the school, classes and courses, interesting classes and courses, those sorts of things. And then we have a third primary kind of content pillar, which is our spotlight stories, which are kind of our profile stories of our students, faculty, and staff and alumni. I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm happy to get into more details about any of that as the conversation progresses.
What a great tease, Sarah. Let's go, Nicole, how about you next?
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Sarah. And thank you, Gabrielle. It's great to be a part of the panel and looking forward to questions from folks. But to get us started, I run communications for Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. And we essentially catalyze research, innovation, and action to improve the health of the oceans for people who depend on them the most. And so I'll just mention that our mission is really to advance knowledge and accelerate solutions for humanity and educate students for a life of purpose. So we're really focused on connecting that insight or all of the research that we do across Stanford having to do with the oceans and connecting that to impact and actual change that we can make in the water. And so how that connects to the different channels that we use for social media are that, you know, it really depends on who our audience is and which channels they're using. And so Twitter is our primary channel. I'm proud to say we have over 17,000 followers now across our Twitter channel. And that really is made up of different partners, collaborators, peers, so different researchers, not only at Stanford, but from all around the world, faculty, scientists, managers doing work in the field, other educational institutions, UN agencies, journalists as well, because it's really important to get the news out about our work with different media and journalists, policymakers. So we really have a diverse sort of audience across Twitter. And, you know, as Sarah was mentioning too, we do use other channels as well. We are active on Facebook and LinkedIn, but basically cross-promoting the content that we are driving primarily through Twitter. We also use Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment's Instagram channel, as that's becoming more and more popular with some of our audiences. And we also do have a YouTube, but that's not as active. So I'll leave it at there for now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm very pleased to be on this panel today with Sarah, Nicole, and Gabrielle. The Department of Chemistry leverages our Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and is to engage with our students, that is our current students, prospective students, our faculty, researchers, staff, alumni, donors, and our corporate recruiters, and the community and the world. We are planning on an Instagram launch, which was postponed temporarily due to the pandemic. And our goal is to highlight research, people, awards, and events. We want to be in the conversation and be in the know and bring all of our stakeholders into it.
That's wonderful. Thank you. What I appreciate about all three of you is you represent a different slice of campus, which I think is great. A center, school department. I mean, it's just a really nice mixture to demonstrate. You know, Sarah, I have to admit, I was a little jealous when you said you had writers writing research stories. That would be a dream of mine. And I see from Nicole, it also sounds great. But it's wonderful to think about how you can leverage, and what I'm hearing from all of you, how you can leverage partners, collaborators to really kind of distribute your message, but more importantly, develop those social connections and engagements for future posts. So with that, knowing that was very helpful, and I will allow all of us at the end to make sure we are promoting our social handles, because I think that is one thing to our audience members we want to encourage. It's maybe not in the DNA to always sound like your self-promotion, but with social channels, it's really important to drive people to those and to continue to repeat what those social channels are. So that'll come at the end. But one of the things that comes up often, and I'm sure you all get this question too, is being in such a data-driven environment. What about the metrics? How do you measure impact? What does success look for you as far it looks like for you for your social media presence? If you can just kind of help the audience understand how you measure success and or a strong social post.
I can chime in to start if that makes sense.
Please.
So I'll give maybe this is an area that I feel like we could have an entire panel on, is just metrics. So I'll give just a brief response so that the others can chime in too. But I think, in general, what you're measuring has to be tied to some thoughtful work around what are your actual goals, right? So I think that that's kind of the most important first step as you look to either launch a social platform or to kind of take your platform to the next step for you, is like, what is it that you are trying to achieve? Without that, I think that we have access to so many metrics, to be honest, on these platforms now. It's quite easy to get lost in the noise. For us at the School of Engineering, we have for quite a bit of time had kind of an overarching goal of extending the reach for our content. So that has been something that has driven what we look at to determine, are we being successful at kind of disseminating research information to a larger population, kind of garnering more awareness for our research content, our school news content, our spotlight content. When it gets down to the nitty-gritty, it's things like reach that we look at. I would also say comments and shares tend to be kind of a richer metric than, what I would consider a vanity metric, and like the likes and those sorts of things. So that gives maybe a slightly high level look at kind of what we're using metrics for. I think we're also, I encourage, and I think it's important to be constantly kind of revisiting and evolving your analytics strategy. So we are actually at a point right now where we're kind of revisiting, like, what is our overarching goal? We've kind of, we feel internally we've achieved our objectives around extending the reach. We have sizable audiences on each of our platforms. And now we're maybe shifting to thinking a little bit more about strengthening our core audiences. And so I think we'll be in some conversations over the next couple of months to kind of determine what are our, to use a jargony term, key performance indicators that would lead us to feel successful in kind of strengthening the core. I would also say, this is a super data rich space. There's access to a lot of things. I think it's really easy to get hung up on numbers and almost get blinded by numbers at some points. And to me, there's like some element of some anecdotal things that we also value where we hear, right? And these are harder to measure, to be honest, but I feel like they're maybe just as valuable, if not more valuable than like just our reach numbers, is stories that we hear about, like, you know, a prospective student saw this spotlight story about someone who was from a similar community to them and then decided that they were going to apply to the School of Engineering. You know, those kinds of like anecdotal stories, I think, are something that we are always having our ears out for. They're not as easy to measure as I think the likes and the comments and the shares. I'll stop there for now.
Great. Twee, how about we go to you and then Nicole, and Nicole, we'll start with you next time.
Sure, sounds good, thank you. So we are a team of 2 in Department of Chemistry within External Relations, Communications and Outreach. So Leanne Rodriguez is my colleague. She's been tracking our social media growth, which has been on Twitter. So that seems to be a popular platform. The Twitter analytics provide insight into what our followers are interested in. So for example, you know, tracking our impressions, which are, you know, the number of views your tweet receives. So this includes followers' timelines and number of times it's appeared in a search and result of someone liking the tweet. A second thing we utilize is the tracking of our engagement. So the stats tell you the number of times that, you know, a user has interacted with your tweet during a month. So I'll echo Sarah's sentiment that, you know, those are numbers and stats. Those are, you know, you can look at the numbers, but it's the context of the numbers, you know, the anecdotal stories and the, you know, what is going on. So just to add, you know, the current context, you know, during the pandemic, you know, a lot of social media platforms sort of took a pause. They took a pause and they sort of reassessed, reanalyzed. Okay, so everything at the moment, you know, it's got to be, how are our staff doing? How are we supporting our faculty? What are the health and safety measures? So there is always a, you know, analyzing and retweaking depending on what is going on in the global environment.
That was really great. And Sarah and Tui, I'm really appreciating your insights, and I'm personally gaining more and learning more from hearing from both of your perspectives. A couple of additional points that I want to add on, because I agree with everything that you've both said. So, first of all, thinking about how you really measure the impact of a tweet or your social media presence overall, I think it's really important to go back to the goal, the overall goal that you have, and to think through, okay, so who's my key audience and what do I hope that they're going to do with this information that I'm sharing out, regardless of the channel that you're using? And so what is the, to use a jargony term, what's the CTA or the call to action? What action do you want them to take? And I think for me, it comes down to really being able to refine a specific goal that you have. So a lot of times we're trying to figure out, what are you trying to make happen that isn't happening right now? And a lot of times, I'm guilty of this. I'll say, oh, we want to increase visibility or increase our reach. And I'm currently working on trying to push myself to go past that and say, okay, how can I get a little bit more specific in that? Instead of, we want to raise awareness with this tweet or this post, thinking about, we really want to use stories about climate change to mobilize X person or group to do Y by Z time. And so trying to make a more refined and specific goal, which we can then measure more accurately. And as both Sarah and Tui mentioned, we use a whole host of different tools to measure our engagement. We do look at the number of likes, although I agree that can be superficial. We look at retweets, we look at comments, and also we dive down into actually figuring out which members of our audience was looking at our content. So, you know, it's one thing to get 50 likes on a post, but are those people within our community and our key audience who are actually liking and commenting and engaging? Or are those just more kind of one-off, or even like friends and family, you know, who are also following us on social, which is great, but maybe not our target audience. So really trying to drill down and figure out who is engaging with our audiences. And And to just add one more point, going beyond the data and thinking about who is actually engaging with our content, I also want to mention that it can be really helpful and valuable to leverage influencers. And I'm not talking about the Kim Kardashians or things, but within each of our spheres, we have a whole different host of influencers and people who are really active and dynamic on social media, who have a lot of followers. And so there's the potential for those individuals or organizations, if they shared out our posts and retweeted, there's a lot of potential to amplify the visibility and potentially get that much closer to achieving our goals. And one quick example, we had that happen where we had some really interesting research. One of our faculty had a paper about impacts of coral reefs in Hawaii and how that was really changing. There was a big coral bleaching event, and the governor of Hawaii, Governor David Ige, actually super active on Twitter, and he tweeted about the research, and we have now been able to really form a partnership and an ongoing research collaboration with him, with his staff, and that was a really unexpected, beautiful consequence of just some very proactive tweeting and getting the visibility from an influencer.
That's great, Nicole. I'm really glad you raised that last point, because on my notes I had asked them about So one of the things that I've seen is when you leverage your partnerships and you include people, that influencers or just partners in your tweet, the likelihood of that tweet to actually go more viral and to get more engagement, at least it's happened to us. I was going to ask you guys, how have you leveraged that opportunity to develop those relationships, whether it's a cold @ or a warm, friendly @? Does anybody have any other tips that they help amplify their tweets?
Yeah, I can just dive in really quickly, but I think that's a great point. Sometimes there are cold @ where you're just sort of, it's an aspirational @ we want to flag this with this person or organization. And if they see it, great. And if they decide to engage, that's even better. But I would encourage folks not to hesitate to do that, just as long as you're being very thoughtful about the content that you are creating and that it is something that you think would be of interest to them. And to do that sort of sparingly with the cold ats. And the warm ats, I think those are great. Definitely when you include an image, which I definitely encourage people to do, including a visual, whether it's a GIF or a photo. You can also tag, I believe, up to 10 individuals and organizations. And so we use that strategy all the time with our content, where we really do want to make sure that it goes out to different partners who are involved, be it other co-authors on a paper that is coming out, or partner institutions, or particular folks in the media, journalists and institutions who we also want this to be on their radar. I would also say we usually do our due diligence and reach out to those individuals beforehand. And I would highly recommend that the planning and coordination behind the scenes is so, so important. And doing that work behind the scenes ahead of time makes it that much more likely that when you do @ somebody, be it cold or a warm @, they're that much more likely to engage and share your content.
I absolutely agree with everything Nicole said. And I might just add also that, yeah, it's really great to be thoughtful about, like, are you trying to impact policy, right? And if so, who are the policymakers that are active on social platforms that you want to begin building relationships with? I think there, like Nicole said, there is the option to kind of do cold pitches in a sense, but the relationship building piece, I think, would likely strengthen your ability to kind of get traction with an influencer. So I think doing your due diligence, well, it goes back to your goal too. Like, what's your goal in using social media? What are you trying to make happen? If it's impacting policy, then I think it's research to find out who are the makers who are influencers on social that you may want to connect with. If it's the media, we don't do this currently where I am at Stanford Engineering, but in a former role, sorry you're hearing my kids in the Zoom world right now, you're hearing my kids. But in a former role I had, we were very active in media relations as well. So it was a huge goal of ours to engage journalists, as Nicole referred to as well, because journalists would then amplify our voice, right, around kind of the research or the policy writings that were happening at my at a former place where I worked as well. So yeah, really getting on Twitter and just kind of, Twitter I think is like really a great place for that. And I think getting on Twitter and really getting to know and doing your homework around who are the influencers in your space is a great idea.
I agree with what Nicole and Sarah have already said. I just wanted to add, this spring we announced we had 3 new faculty members joining our department, and they were Twitter savvy, so that helped get high engagement on Twitter. So that's always helpful, of faculty that are social media savvy. And then stories about faculty who are active in social media. So for us within chemistry, there's Carolyn Bertozzi, Laura DeSama, are very popular. We had a news story on there highlighting their skills on social media. And then for high profile events like our Johnson Symposium, we have a student volunteer that helps us live tweet, the entire event day of, on our Twitter page, as it happens with one hashtag and all the posts.
That's fantastic. So we threw a lot at our audience right there, especially if you're not on Twitter, and we were just speaking a whole bunch of social media lingo. So let me do an attempt to kind of coalesce 3 points that I heard, and if I miss anything, please jump in. The first, which I couldn't agree more with, is goal. Identify your goal before you even begin to plan your social media strategy. Understand what you want to achieve and what your goal is really in that communication venue as it pertains to social media. And then what I'm hearing, and in between the lines of what Nicole was saying, and Sarah, I'm going to just add, be a good citizen on Twitter or whatever social media platform you're on. Do your due diligence is the third one I heard is, understand who your influencers are, who your community members are, right? Understand who your audience, who follows you, who's your power users, always liking you. You can at least rely on those handful of folks and make sure you're cultivating and stewarding them. But also, if you are looking, as Sarah said, whether it's policymakers or just basic influencers in your space, make sure that you are engaging with their content as you're expecting them to engage with yours. And then, Twee, I couldn't agree with you more. The one great thing we all have are outstanding faculty and great students. And so if there are stories that we can highlight to penetrate those networks, I think that that's also another great example of how to amplify a post. So I'm going to, did I get everything? Did I capture everything okay? Okay, good. I'm going to move to our next question and talk about a memorable post or campaign, or I'd like to say memorable moment, because for me, not all of those memorable moments are success stories. I actually learned in social media more from something that didn't go as I had intended, because it allows me to check my assumptions. So I'm going to open it up and just say, we love success stories and we should definitely tell those. But if there's also one where it didn't go as planned, please feel free to share that as an example with our audience. So Nicole, let's start with you, Twee, and then Sarah.
Sure. So, and let me just start by saying, Gabrielle, I really appreciate you sort of inviting the space to also talking about, flaunting our flaws and learning from our different experiences, because especially with campaigns and for people who are joining who are newer to social media too, regardless of the channel, it's a new experience. It's, a platform that you do have to learn and engage in. And there is a lot of lingo and trying to understand the ins and outs. And I can think of a recent example when I was in a bit of a sticky situation, actually, because we have a relationship with this top tier journalist, very well known, who discovered some really powerful findings about illegal fishing and uncovered the largest fleet of illegal fishers in the world using this really cool data technology with a nonprofit who we're partnering with. So anyway, they had this big news story and they had produced a couple of videos that they wanted us to share on our channels. And our co-director, who is so terrific and so gung-ho, had kind of just said, yes, we'll do it. And I took a look at the videos and they were actually not in line with our sort of style and brand. And this is something that I think, even if you're not a part of a communications team, and if you're crafting and posting social media that's just on your own, I do think it's an important lesson to just really try to be consistent and thinking about, what is my voice? What is my brand? And, whether it's a part of a Stanford institution or it's you personally, just knowing that your post can reach anyone and they can be misinterpreted, or they may show up outside of their original context. So to really be thoughtful about the messaging that you're posting. And so what we wound up doing was just jumping on the phone, having a quick conversation, and being able to come to a middle ground where we didn't wind up sharing the videos, but we shared some really compelling photos, and we still linked to the findings and the news story itself, which was the most important point. And we were still able to use some visually compelling assets too. So being able to find that middle ground, but not losing sense of yourself, your brand, and being consistent with the content that you share.
Thank you for sharing your story, Nicole. I also want to share a story. So it's a little bit, there's a new program that we had launched. It's called the ChemWell program. It is a new health and wellness program within the chemistry department that's accessible to everyone inside the chemistry community, as well as during the pandemic outside of our community. As I was compiling a story to highlight this program onto our website, one of our key partners was a company representative that I, had been liaisoning on a quote. So something unexpected happened. Basically, the company's HR team and PR team wanted to have final say and review and edit the entire news story. So, it's a little bit of kind of negotiation back and forth in terms of, is this your story? Is this the Department of Chemistry story? So it took a little bit of going back and forth. However, we did come to a compromise, and in just echoing Nicole's point, what is the goal of the story and what is the brand of Department of Chemistry? And when we're liaising with different corporate partners, there is typically, in my experience, a sort of negotiation of who has final say in the content. So that is definitely a learning experience and something to help move forward in future collaborations with different stakeholders.
This one was interesting. I appreciate hearing both Nicole and Sui's stories as well. And I will share something related to a series that we run. So we have a series called hashtag I Am an Engineer. We started this series about 4.5 years ago. I actually started the series when I arrived at the school, and the goal with the series was to actually, we were actually mimicking Humans of New York. If anyone's familiar with that platform on Instagram, they're wildly popular. If you don't follow them, I totally recommend them for their just like incredible storytelling about human beings. But so we've been running the series for about 4.5 years. Through the series, we attempt to kind of go beyond our research stories, which are a little bit more, slightly more technical, although we do write for a general public audience. So we're not writing scientific stories at all or papers. But this series is meant to focus on the people in the field and to really kind of help people get to know, like, who are these researchers behind this work and what is the experience like to be a researcher? The bigger goal behind that series is that, beyond just extending the reach for our research content at the School of Engineering, we as a communications team have a goal around storytelling in a way that makes the field more accessible to people who have not historically been represented in engineering spaces. So my whole goal with the series was to break down stereotypes, right? Break down stereotypes. It's not all white males who are in this field. There are people from all walks of life in this field. And, it's not all uber successful Stanford, overachievers that are in the field. Like, there are people who fail over and over again, but through persistence have gone on to get their PhD or, been able to get into a faculty position or, whatever the final kind of, we all see the successful end product, but we don't see the journey kind of along the way. So our goal was to kind of make the journey along the way to these successes more transparent. So I don't, some of the hard stuff that we've come across is like a little bit maybe difficult to share, I think. But I think, what we have realized as we've done this story, we're not writing stories that are kind of trying to tie things up in a pretty bow or, talk about how perfect an accomplishment of somebody's is. Like we really are telling kind of people's real journeys. And so people get vulnerable when they share their stories with us. And that I think is something that makes the content really resonate with people in the end, but it also opens us up for some critiques in some judgmental ways that are not productive in a social space. And of course, that's always a danger in social spaces, is that, behind the anonymity of a keyboard, people feel more empowered to kind of like lash out. So I think, one thing we have learned through this series is, given the kind of vulnerable content that we aim to share as a way to engage people more emotionally around what research looks like and can be, we really have to monitor our comment streams after we post one of these stories to ensure that we're on top of and this is where some of the hard situations come in, is where do you draw a line in terms of what comments do you remove, what comments do you allow to stay there? And I don't think I even have like a black and white answer to provide, because it's literally case by case for kind of every comment that we see come in around like, all right, what's the decision here, and what's the rationale that drives the decision about whether or not we allow this comment to live. So anyways, I think, that series has been really successful for us on a number of levels, but it also opens us up to just having to be really vigilant in terms of monitoring the conversation that they create.
Nicole, I saw a hand go up. I have a follow-up question, because before we get to the final question that I have for you, which is your word of wisdom, the questions are coming in, ladies. So I want to pull in some of those questions before we get to our final, because I think they're very relevant to some of the conversations we've had thus far. So Nicole, go with your follow-up, and then I'm going to pull from some of the comments that are coming in.
Great, thanks. And I'll be super quick. I just want to thank you, Sarah. You're hitting on such an important point. And if I can just reiterate, I think it's so important to moderate comments judiciously, and it is really hard to figure out where do you draw the line in the sand. And so something that I'm doing in my role is really thinking about how obviously comments are an important part of social networking services, regardless of the channel. And we don't delete comments simply because we disagree with a commenter's point of view or because the commenter has reacted negatively. But on the other hand, we do monitor our social accounts and profiles that expose, private data of others, that contain commercial solicitations, which we get a lot, actually surprisingly amount, and any comments which are factually erroneous or libelous, or if they're off topic, which also happens more frequently than you might think. And of course, anything that's threatening or abusive, or any obscenities. So that's sort of a little bit more about how we do try to draw the line in the sand. But I agree with Sarah, it's a case-by-case basis.
So it's such good. We could spend a whole session just on this topic. But one of the questions coming in is about, Sarah, the example you used about your I Am an Engineer series. How, and I think this is a good one, because in the arena of research, right, we in scholarship, it is very academic, it is very on brand for our students and our faculty to want to put their professional face and almost a guard up, right? The question is, how do you get people to open up? How do you get them to get to that authentic voice while also keeping it professional and on brand for the school and or for the individual?
It's such a good question. I think my my quick answer to that is that one of my favorite interview questions for our spotlight stories is precisely what you've asked us, Gabrielle, is what is a challenge that you faced, right? Because we are all human and we all face challenges and we all have a story about a failure that we also, that's not the end of our story, right? We go on and we learn from our failures. They make us better. They get us ready to be who we are today. So I think that's, that is maybe a quick answer to the question around how do we get people to open up. I want to also just go on the record to say, like, we do not, we absolutely work with whoever we are interviewing to ensure that they feel safe sharing whatever they have shared. We will never, ever run or publish a story without the permission of the person that we're talking to. And, there's an editing period that we go through to kind of potentially massage things to make sure that we're capturing, it is like of the utmost importance to me that we capture the person's story the way they want it to be shared, not the way we want it to be shared. So we don't want to go places that people don't want to go. But I think that, typically it's been interesting because I agree with you, like there's an academic kind of face you want to put on for your peers or your colleagues. And so it is interesting we've asked the question of faculty. Of course, I don't know all of the faculty personally that we interview, so I'm not sure like how honest they're being with me or not about their personal stories. But I think, we are in a space too where I think there's more acceptance around, like we're not perfect. We're not all just like perfect. We didn't arrive being an associate professor of something just by being perfect all along, right? Like we all have these stories, and I think ultimately on social, like that content does really well because it's so relatable, right? It's like we allow people to see themselves in this faculty member, and then to like even spark an inspiration, like, well, if that person had this failure or had this kind of shortcoming in their education process, right? I can still see myself, like I can see myself in the space. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent. I think the answer to the question is really just talking about challenges, asking about challenges, and normalizing the fact that, like, I think that's so important for mental health for communities like Stanford too, where we have a group of just uber achievers. Like the mental health piece is really important. So normalizing that, like, there are failures, there are struggles, there are challenges, and they don't have to break you. And everybody has them. So in any case, now I am rambling, but yeah, the challenge piece.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it's really important what you said. I want to hone in on this in case people didn't hear it. Is when you're writing a human interest story, first of all, I agree. Human interest stories for us always supersede any other type of story that we post. They're just, for some reason, they're very popular. But so that aspect I always try to convey when I'm interviewing somebody is just to say, look at our audience. It has a history of really liking human interest stories and authentic voice stories. But I think what you said, which is so important in the process of this, is making them feel in control of the story up front, right? So when you start your interview, you're letting them know they are going to have full review of what you write, and before it's posted, they'll get to see or view the articles. So Nicole, I don't know if you had anything, or Twee, if you had anything to add.
I just had a quick point. So thinking about, first of all, I agree, Sarah, wholeheartedly with everything you said. Thank you so much for explaining it and so eloquently. I also think when we're really trying to get to the heart of a story or a topic and really make somebody feel safe and comfortable, one place where we often start is learning more about the faculty member or the researcher or the person who we're profiling. We have a quarterly newsletter where we like to highlight a different person from the Center for Ocean Solutions team. And one place that we often start is getting to ask, why did you become passionate in ocean legal issues or ocean acidification or climate change in the ocean or whatever their particular interest area is, but trying to learn more about where did that come from? Because there had to be some event or situation that sort of sparked that. And so oftentimes getting to learn more about an individual from earlier on in their career, if they're willing and comfortable to share that, can be a really nice way to illustrate that, this passion, this interest has been there for a long time. And the person has likely encountered different challenges over that course of time. But it's something that's nice that connects to our audiences too, which, might be earlier on in their careers. And so that might be a nice touch point to then connect with, a younger researcher or graduate who's maybe going through a similar challenge or issue.
So there is a lot of questions coming in on just getting started. And Twee, I don't know if you can maybe kick off our conversation and give some helpful tips to somebody who is not on social media or might be on social media to stay connected to family from afar. So what would be some of your recommendations to just getting started? How do you build your credibility as a researcher online and build your voice for a wider distribution?
Yes, excellent question. My advice is to just start. I know, for researchers, it can be daunting and overwhelming because there's so many platforms to choose from. But honestly, just pick one or two that you are comfortable with and just get started. Because now more than ever, you are accessible to anyone, which has not always been the case, in our history. So you have this opportunity to connect with the researchers, connect with the community, and people want to connect with you. They're just looking for the opportunity, and thinking of a brand and a strategy, but we have to humanize that, right? They want to hear the story. How did you get to where you are? Just like Sarah Nicole said, what were your struggles? And if they can see yourself in their shoes, then they would think, okay, hey, this is possible for me, or I may consider Stanford. This person looks like me or is from a similar background as me. So it's very, very powerful. And thinking about just getting started is, there are many. Go to a digital strategist. Go to your communications team, university communications team. They're more than willing to help. And I think it's just the getting started piece and getting familiar with all of the technology. But I think once you get started and you can see that you have an opportunity to amplify the reach, of your research, because ultimately, what is the goal of that research, right? It's to have change or have, the research community read it, peer review it, or, approve it, yes. But if it doesn't get to the wider audience, then, it's a missed opportunity. So I would say just get started.
Great. Sarah, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I would add in that I totally love the attitude of just go for it, just get on and try something, I think that's a great place to start from. I also think, being thoughtful, as researchers, you all are experts at something, right? Or you are developing really deep expertise in an area that you can educate people about. So I would also encourage you to spend 30 minutes, thinking and writing, or whatever the mode is that helps you kind of get your thoughts collected, really hone in on what's your impact, because that's kind of like your magic to add to the social space, right? The impact of your research. I think you have a lot to, probably each one of you that is on here and is involved in some kind of research venture has some education to offer to the world. So I think the more you can kind of peg onto that, the more you're going to get traction and kind of get noticed.
And if I can just jump in really quickly,
yes,
thanks. I'll add on that this is a super not sexy answer, but it's something that I found to be really useful, in that when I was getting started, I looked at other folks who were on social media and who were just killing it. And I thought, okay, what are they doing? And I kind of copied them, I was, okay, are they using a hashtag? Are they using a photo? Are they not using jargon and trying to explain something very simply? Are they trying to be honest? And just looking at those examples, whether it was people who I knew personally or, they were kind of more popular figures or organizations, I just kind of started there and thought about what I liked and why I followed them. And then I tried to replicate that on my personal feeds as well. And, just kind of thinking about it that way. And there's so much content out there. I think, it's important too, to kind of think about who do I like following and why? And what elements of that could you then recreate on your own feed or channel?
Wow, ladies, again, you took what could have been a whole hour conversation and distilled it into some nice, actionable points. So let me just try to reiterate. So for those of you who are watching who have not yet jumped on, hopefully we give you a little bit of courage to start. So I love Twee's just get started. So I think that that's a big one. It seems like it's this, the world is watching you, but really it is somewhat of a forgiving space, and you can adjust and move forward. The other thing I loved is, and this is kind of one of the things that I was going to say, is be a consumer, right? Nicole, I think you're right on. Get on these channels. If you don't know what channel, start getting on and just watching. You don't have to contribute. Just watch and listen and see, are they the right people that you want to build your network around? Are they on that space? Is this the type of conversation you want to contribute to? And then how they're doing it. I think we all are probably guilty of watching each other and then adapting for our space. I think that's also another exciting thing about this space that I like is when I started my career, there was no such thing as Facebook, Twitter, or even, you know, okay, maybe we had the web. I won't age myself that much, but it's an evolving space, right? Each of us are learning trends and things that have changed. Tools are changing every cycle. So it's really an evolving space. So don't feel like you can't jump in. We're all jumping in a sense, every single day we get on. And then the last one is, and Sarah, I think you said this, which I think is such a powerful statement, is embrace your expertise. You have something, everyone on this call has something to contribute to the larger discussion that's happening on social media, and embrace your expertise and find content that is out there. If it's not your own research, if there's other research that colleagues are doing and you want to add your voice and your narrative to it, then use this the social media as an opportunity to flex your expertise, but also, as Nicole mentioned earlier, to build those alliances and those partnerships online as well. So did I forget anything? Those are pretty basic. There are probably 20 other steps we could all give you, but follow all of us on our channels and engage with us as well. We will end with what our channels are, so that people, because I know there's also questions about connecting with all of us individually as well. So we'll end with that. Okay. Now that we've given everybody kind of a basic primer of get started, and here's kind of a way to get started, there are questions about channels and which channel to start with. So the two that were mentioned were TikTok, Instagram, and the other kind of more Gen Z, shall I say, appealing. How do, you know, we're not on TikTok. We do have a few of our branch libraries who are on Instagram, which is great. So how do you kind of work through the noise of the ecosystem of all these channels and their ever evolvingness? So could you maybe start, Nicole, and then Sarah, and then Tweet?
Sure. So it's a great question. And that's something that is so exciting and can also be challenging about navigating the social media landscape, especially if you're new, is that there are so many channels and different ways to share your content. And for us at the Center for Ocean Solutions, I joined about 3.5 years ago, and we were super active on Facebook, but not as active on Twitter. And it's been pretty interesting because even within that time period, our priorities as an organization, as a center, have shifted much more toward focusing within Stanford and with different researchers. And our sort of newer target audience is very active on Twitter. So we made a pivot, and we noticed also that it was more friends and family who were following us on Facebook. And we also branched out into Instagram, but that was through our overarching Woods Institute for the Environment's channel. Because we also didn't want to run the risk of creating a presence on so many channels and then not being able to actually manage and maintain the content. I would say, you know, as others have pointed out, definitely err on the side of jumping in for sure, what Tui was saying, but also, you know, taking baby steps, starting small. Don't spread yourself too thin at the risk of not being able to keep up. It is really, really doesn't look good if you have a social media channel, let's say our Facebook, if we no longer updated it, but we still had it there and someone went to go take a look and the last post was maybe from a year ago. It runs a reputational risk and harm to the brand, be it an organizational center brand or your personal brand. So start small, think about where your target audience is and, you know, which channels they're using. I'll leave it at that for now.
Does anybody else have anything to add to Nicole? Because I look at the time and I cannot believe we have just flown through 52 minutes. Anything to add on that last point, Tweet?
Just a quick note, there are platforms to help you manage those social media platforms. Hootsuite is one where you could schedule your post. So just something to think about, but definitely don't spread yourself thin. It's better to do, you know, quality targeted social media posts than, you know, so a lot of spread. Yeah, so you gotta be strategized with that.
So Twee, you mentioned a great thing, management of content. So Hootsuite you mentioned, we use TweetDeck. Are there other platforms you guys use really quickly to give?
Yeah, Hootsuite is what we use. We've used Sprout Social in the past. Those are two big ones. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
All right. The next question, which I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 4 minutes, is we talked about metrics and impact. Are there certain platforms that you use to help measure? And if there, and I know there are free ones, so if there are free versus paid, if you can also articulate kind of the mix that you use for those. Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think we do actually use the native analytics offerings of Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I think back in, you know, early days, they were not quite as sophisticated as they are becoming. So we've actually turned back to using kind of Facebook's analytics and Twitter's analytics and Instagram's analytics and YouTube as well. So there's that. We do use, you know, there's things like Bitly, which I think everyone is familiar with. If you're looking to track like how many clicks something is getting, just so that you can do that. A service like Bitly allows you to just keep tabs on how many people are clicking via Twitter or Facebook. There, it gets a little bit kind of. You can like do things to like append parameters to these links so that you can actually track where the clicks, what platform the clicks are coming from. So there's that. And then, you know, I would also recommend for people who are interested, our university communications team. I just have to give them a shout out. They are so sophisticated with how they are tracking content and the platforms that they're using. I really think they're the experts on campus for how to kind of best rein in kind of an overall metric strategy. So I know John Stafford is the like assistant vice, I forget his precise title, but maybe it's assistant vice president of digital strategy for the university. So his entire team, I think, is a good place to go to as well for more resources there.
I think appropriate shout out, certainly, Sarah. Thank you for doing that. Does anybody have anything else to add as far as metric platforms that they're using? I second Sarah. I think if you're going to start anywhere, before you invest in fancier, more expensive platforms, use the native kind of built-in analytics for Facebook, Twitter, even Instagram. There are, you know, free ways to monitor and manage, and it gets you just into the mindset of what you're trying to manage and what each metric means, and it means sometimes different things on different platforms. So I would think that that's an excellent place to start. And then just as there are as many channels, there are even more metric systems and softwares, and it gets back to, I think, the where we started, right, is what is your goal? And once you answer that, then you can kind of put into place not only a content strategy, but also a what platforms you can use to help service you. All right, I promised everyone they would have time to give out their social channels. So Sarah, Twee, and Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you to quickly just give your handles and or directions for how people can connect.
I'll jump in really quickly. Ours are pretty simple. On Twitter, we are at Stanford Eng. On all the other platforms, we are at Stanford School of Engineering. So pretty straightforward.
Yes, for us on Twitter, we're at Stanford UChem, Facebook, Stanford Chemistry. It's pretty straightforward.
And for us at Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions, we are at Ocean Solutions. That's it across our channels.
Great. And we are at Stanford Libs. So we hope that you will follow all of us, engage with all of us online. And if you have questions, I'm sure all of us can be found through Stanford Who, and would encourage and welcome. I think the biggest advice here is if you are a part of a school or unit that has a communication team, definitely connect with them and see how you might be able to leverage their expertise. All right, with that, I will turn it back to Amy and my colleagues at the library who've put on a fantastic day. If there's not anything else, anybody has any parting words? All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Sarah, Nicole, and Twee.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabrielle, and all of our wonderful panelists. And what a great group of women. I'm very excited to see a panel full of women, by the way. I thoroughly enjoyed that. You might actually have inspired me to get on Twitter, which I am not. So we'll see. Some things to think about, but maybe I should just do it, right, as Twee says. So this is the end of our presentations for today. I want to remind everyone that this is just the first half. We will be doing more of Gear Up for Research Communication tomorrow. And this is what you have to look forward to if you're interested in coming. These times are all Pacific time, since we know our Stanford community is now somewhat more spread around the globe than they have been. 9 a.m. Pacific time. Kristen, I didn't get the pronunciations for everyone's names, but we're going to have a presentation on how to talk with the press. This will be really useful for a lot of students, I think. Then we have this presentation by Helen Chen and Janae Cohn on creating an online portfolio. I have attended a day-long or 2-day-long session with Helen and a colleague before on doing this, and it was spectacular. So I'm sure this one will be good as well. And then we have a series of really fun lightning talks planned for the 11 a.m. Pacific time hour, with mostly, I think, postdocs and graduate students, but I see a couple of our library staff sprinkled in there as well, talking to you about some really interesting topics. And so we very much look forward to having you hopefully join us again tomorrow. And again, before you leave, if you would like to, the bit.ly link here is a place for you to share with us ideas about other things that you would like us to do a Gear Up event in the future. We do this every year, or just a one-off presentation, seminar on some topic. We're happy to try to arrange things that would be useful for you. So thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.